Welcome to the Fire These Times, a podcast dedicated to the easy task of tackling the 21st century from the periphery. I'm your host, Joey Ayub, and my goal is to use this platform to connect with activists, scholars, writers, and other weird folks from around the world to link our stories and interests up. Join me as we get into all sorts of futurisms, from solar punk to degrowth, as we explore meaningful ways of creating links between the peoples on the periphery, and as we explore various topics from tech to anti-authoritarian politics, feminism, abolitionism, decolonialism, anti-racism, and all the other fun isms in between. This podcast is ad-free and accessible to everyone thanks to the generous donations of Patreon supporters on patreon.com/firethesetimes. For as little as $5 a month or $50 a year, you can help keep this podcast independent that way. If you're a student, unemployed, or in any kind of financial difficulties, you can support with $2 a month or $20 a year. There are also other methods such as on PayPal or buymeacoffee.com, and you can find the relevant links in the description below or on the website. My goal is to make this project financially sustainable so that I can work on producing valuable content on a regular basis, such as this podcast, the newsletter, my essays, various online resources, and hopefully eventually YouTube essays as well. And if you like the content of this podcast, you can also check out the newsletter. In that newsletter, which I release on a quasi-monthly basis, I reflect on some of the topics discussed on this podcast and try to take them a bit further. The newsletter is free and you can get it by simply subscribing directly on the website. The Fire These Times is named after the James Baldwin book The Fire Next Time, and the music is by Ibrahim Yusuf. Thank you for listening and take care. Hey everyone. This is a conversation with Asser Khattab. He's a Syrian writer who has reported on Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq for various international news outlets. We spoke about his essay for New Lines magazine entitled Why I Stopped Writing About Syria. As you'll quickly see, Asser's experience mirrors my own quite a bit, although there are also some interesting differences. So we primarily kind of talked about that. How did he start writing about Syria and why did he stop writing about Syria? We spoke about the wider problems that we see in journalism, such as pigeonholing Arab journalists. And then we kind of went into a broader conversation about both journalism, safe spaces, what do we consider as a normal quote-unquote upbringing, and of course we spoke about the dangers of living in Lebanon as an undocumented Syrian, which is part of his experience. And finally we discuss how we both feel survivor's guilt as well as imposter syndrome at times. So that's it from me, folks. I hope you'd enjoy this conversation and find it as important as I did, and take care.
I'm Asser Khattab. I'm a Syrian journalist who lived in Syria, then in Lebanon, and now in Paris, in France. I'm not really doing journalism at the moment. I have a full-time job at an NGO, but I still write as a freelancer from time to time.
So we'll be primarily talking about this essay that you wrote for New Lines, which is called Why I Stopped Writing About Syria. But I'm going to pin this for just a few minutes because I want actually to ask the question that kind of precedes that in many ways. Like, why did you start writing about Syria? Can you kind of talk to us about this a bit?
Yeah. It's a tough question. I was born in Syria and I lived there until I had to leave the country after the beginning of the war, a few years after the war, and I always wanted to be a journalist. For a long time, it was my only passion since I was at school, and I hadn't realized really that I wanted to do Syria per se. I mean, before the war, Syria wasn't very much in the news, and also it wasn't an environment as it still isn't today for journalism and for people to practice the career in a professional way. But I knew that it would be maybe in politics, maybe in global affairs, maybe it will have to do, I knew maybe it's not going to be, for example, sports journalism or music journalism. I knew that my interests also with journalism will be more on that side. When the revolution began, and then, of course, I would only start working in journalism a few years after that because I was still studying at the time. And when I wanted to begin working in journalism, I suppose it only made sense that being there and having kind of language skills to be able to work with international media made it the only option that makes sense to work on the war in Syria and on what's going on in Syria and the different aspects of it, whether cultural or social or economic. That kind of set me on the path that would continue when I went to Lebanon, where I found it great at the time, of course. I went and met all of these journalists, and they would look at me as if they were looking at a treasure. And of course, I appreciated that very much because I was coming from Syria and, fresh out of the country. and with contacts, with the context in mind, with the experience of having lived in the country, and also, having already started working as a journalist. So I was getting jobs because of that, mainly to do the war in Syria. And for a while, I enjoyed it, as strange as this may sound, when we were writing about something that's very tragic and catastrophic as the Syrian story. And for a while, and still until the end, I felt that it was also kind of a responsibility that I have, maybe, especially after seeing certain flaws in the journalism scene and the media scene as well, that I'm sure we're going to talk about.
You're being very kind with this. Yeah.
And but I did, at some point, I did feel that it went from me looking at myself as someone who's qualified to do this and therefore should be happy to do that, to feeling that I'm actually trapped doing the serious story. Uh, First, I was excited to do it. Then I was fine, I have to do it because this is the only thing that I'm known to be able to do. And then I just wanted to leave it. And this is when I also found it really hard, because one of many reasons was that it was hard to make people see that I could have any professional value doing anything else but the Syria story.
Yeah. So usually I prepare a very long document that I send to guests. And this time, I mean, I did send some stuff, but it wasn't as long as others because, to be honest, I identify with a lot of what you wrote about. And we'll get more into that because there are some similarities, there are some differences as well, obviously. But one thing that I would say immediately, like to start, is that did not start as a journalist. I didn't really have much of I wasn't against it. I was kind of curious about it, but I wasn't necessarily going into it. I mean, my undergrad was in environmental health, for example. So I thought I'm going to work in some eco sector, some NGO, some institute, something along those lines. But long story short, 2015 happened in Lebanon. It was at the time biggest uprising, and that's I started a bit before, but that's when I really started volunteering for this media organization, Global Voices, and then one thing led to another. I became first a paid journalist and then editor there. Sorry, and it felt like 10 years has passed essentially when I've been doing this. So that's not really the problem. The problem is more similar to what you mentioned. It's the pigeonholing, right? This is kind of the term. And I found myself reporting from the ground, on the ground in 2015 as a co-organizer, in 2019 just the biggest uprising after that, as a participant. And that's when I would really see the attention coming towards me. And at one point, which was basically 2019, I had a moments, I should say, it was a long period, where I felt that there was something very toxic about this entire thing. Because I also started kind of like how you describe it. First, it was interesting. It was, I'm not going to say fun, but definitely healthy. It felt like I was doing something. I was productive. I was contributing to something. This was important. Whatever this was, it was mostly about Lebanon or Palestine at the time, before I started covering more on Syria at some point after 2015, 2016. And I couldn't, as much as I could, even when I was pitching articles, it took me quite some time, a few years to be honest, before I was able to pitch articles and be accepted regardless of that thing that I was associated with, which was Lebanon expert, the Lebanese writing about Lebanon, etc., etc. So this sort of brings me to the main question, obviously, which is the title of your essay. Why did you stop writing about Syria, and how much of this is familiar, how much is different?
Mm-hmm. This sounds very similar to my experience, and I'm not surprised that you and I had sort of a similar challenge when it comes to this kind of matter. This is one of the main reasons why. So maybe I think this is one of three main reasons why I decided or reached a point where I found out, I'd rather to phrase it like that I can't work about Syria anymore. And the being pigeonholed, that is. Because not for a second, not until now, do I think it a bad thing that someone out there thinks that I'm a good, knowledgeable source on Syria, or someone to be followed or read or consulted when you want to know more about Syria. No, I take that as a great honor. But when I wanted to move on, let's say people need to move on sometimes professionally, especially in journalism. You know how it works. People get jobs, they move on from theme to theme sometimes, and sometimes from country to country, region to region. And this mobility is also something we're going to discuss because it applies to some more than others. Yeah. And when I reached that point, I would always face a big roadblock. Sometimes a person in charge, for example, who would be happy to let certain journalists go from place to place, would think it quite unrealistic, or even maybe somewhat ridiculous, that I would be doing anything else but Syria, because I'm Syrian, I know the language, and I have been working on this for a few years, so I know people on all sides. I can speak to sources on the ground. I can bring a certain kind of local understanding to the table that maybe other colleagues don't have. And what confused me always is, while I would hope that what they think about my knowledge of Syria is true, is that also they never thought that this set of skills cannot be applied elsewhere on another theme or in another place. Whereas when it comes to a different journalist, they don't ask themselves that question. And I also started to wonder why that is exactly. I mean, first, when the difference between me and that journalist is, for example, 2 decades of experience, and very, very different. I'm still like a beginner compared to them. I would understand, but then I started seeing more journalists who are exactly my age, have exactly the number of years of my experience, for example, and I began to struggle to find the exact difference between me and them as a journalist, so the way I see it, and yet editors and bosses seemed to see something that I couldn't see. And that was the sort of pigeonholing that I still suffer from until today, actually. I mean, until today, if I decide tomorrow to go back to Syria, or if I have to tomorrow to go back to working on Syria, I can almost guarantee that I'm going to find a bunch of offers. And that's something I am thankful for, I'm sure. But I want to do anything else. And none of that seems quite actually available to me. And this is one of my problems. There are 2 main issues. You can stop me whenever you want, of course, because we're moving on from one issue to another. One other issue also had with journalism, but not so much with being pigeonholed itself, even though it's related to it, but it's just by the limits and the restrictions that I had, that I felt, and from speaking to other people who are in similar positions at the same or other companies, it was identical to their situation. And that is everyone who worked at international media outlets in our region, and I'm sure in other regions as well. My knowledge will be restricted to Syria and Lebanon and Egypt, and the countries I'm more familiar with. Is that the role of a local reporter, as they call it, or a news assistant, fixer, stringer, all these terms, was, even when I still wanted to do Syria, and regardless of the fact that I ceased to want to do that at some point, was very limiting. You're not even regarded as a real journalist at some point. For many people, I still have not become a journalist at this point now.
Because you're too biased, quote unquote.
Yes, that's one reason. So you're too biased. So this was one of the dilemmas that I spoke about in the essay, is that within the context of Syria, I'm seen as too biased because I'm Syrian. And I'm okay, I see your point. Let's move me on then to another country. But then they won't move you to another country because you're Syrian. You should use your skills on Syria. And that's what I would face every time. And I couldn't see a way out of this. But there's also the fact that there's a certain distinction between, regardless of where the country that we're working on, between this news assistant, this local reporter, who is by all means a journalist, a real journalist, and the person who is being sent from abroad. And it's not this person's fault. There's a lot that this person who is being sent from abroad that they can do to help. And I had colleagues who recognized these boundaries that I was facing and that they were unnecessary, and they drew a certain differentiation between me and them that shouldn't exist, and tried to push, but the solution wasn't in their own hands. This person and the local person are working in the same environment. The local person brings certain things to the table that the foreigner doesn't, and the foreigner brings things to the table that the local doesn't sometimes, including a certain kind of impunity that locals don't enjoy, so a certain kind of ability to raise their tone or raise their voice about certain things with certain sense of security about it. I felt at some points that I was not being looked at as a real journalist. I felt over and over again that I was not paying my dues, because I was also not rushing. I'm not saying that I should have been made bureau chief of some international newspaper. No, I recognize how little my experience is compared to some others, and how young I am, and all of that. But what I didn't think that I was even on a route somewhere. I did not see the path, and I asked repeatedly to see the path, and I didn't. And I realized that there wasn't one, and I tried that with more than one company. The first of which ended in very unfortunate circumstances. I had just had to leave Syria in a very abrupt manner, and barely made it happen, only to lose that job the second day, because we don't need, quote unquote, we don't need someone outside of Syria, we need someone in Syria. And that was it. And this is where it all started with me, and of course it will continue now. While I felt that it was great because I worked with big names of big media outlets that maybe I still benefit from professionally today, and met great colleagues and learned a lot for sure. But I was hoping, when I was working in each one of those companies, I was seeing myself as a member of the family and someone who would want to dedicate a big chunk of my career to that family, and to work for them, maybe on Syria now, and then in the future somewhere else, and grow and put in a lot of effort. And of course, how it is in journalism, we work days and nights and weekends, and you're always working, always putting in a lot of effort. And yet, unfortunately, I did not think that I was getting what I deserved in that sense, and not because of how good or bad I was, just because of, as an employee, doing their job and putting in a certain risk, whether to my own mental health or to my own physical safety. I was not seeing anything coming to me in return, and I'm sure we'll readdress this. And this is also where I go to the third main reason, which is the actual mental health aspect, which is a little bit different, but also related from the first two. And it's where I think where everything came together to haunt me here in France, actually. The fact that, yes, I am Syrian, and I lived in Syria. Of course, we tend to forget about the years before the revolution, which weren't particularly easy or perfect either. And during the revolution and the war, and then afterwards, and the life in Lebanon, which also, I didn't get to talk a lot about in the essay, but it wasn't particularly easy being a Syrian in Lebanon. Even though I was, one of the 1% of the Syrian refugees in Lebanon, I was in a very, very good situation compared to the vast majority of Syrians there. And then coming here, and I think here is now, is as stable and secure my life has ever been. And it's because of that. This is my own analysis, of course. I keep talking about mental health issues and things that I don't really know much about, but this is how I've been thinking about it, and what I drew from experiences of other. And as the person in the essay warned me, is that you could find yourself in a stable and good condition for the first time, and this is when everything that's happened before comes back to haunt you, and this is where it kind of all came crashing almost exactly a year ago.
Yeah, well, this is one of the similarities, because I found out from, I think it was in the essay, that we actually left Beirut the same month, February 2020.
Yeah.
And in my case, it was because I was waiting for the visa for Switzerland. I mentioned this many times, I won't get into it too much, but I was in Scotland. I left for various reasons. And the transition period, basically, I had to be in Beirut, like in Lebanon, for the visa. And just so happens that that's when the uprising happened. I moved back in, I think, July or something. So I stayed there for October, November, December. And then February I left. And obviously this was in the context of, well, the pandemic was starting in February. People were still seeing each other, but at least in Europe, but it was in the air. We knew what was coming in many ways. And I was living with my then fiance, now wife, in a place called Ferney-Voltaire, which is on the border between France and Switzerland, on the French side. And it's a pretty I don't know if I would call it rural. It's like more suburban, but there's like a nice forest. It's pretty calm. It's not a lot of activity even outside of a pandemic. So what was really surreal is that I would go on these long walks regularly, usually listening to music or podcast, or just in the forest without anything, just listening to the forest in many ways. And in my mind, I was still in Lebanon because I left February, and then pandemic, so everything was remote anyway. And I wasn't really able to start this new phase of the PhD. It was just, I was doing it a bit online while in Lebanon, and then just continue doing it online, but while in Switzerland/France.
Yeah.
And it's because of that that the 2 years since, now it's a bit better. In the past few months, it's been a bit better. But they were almost as difficult, if not more difficult, to write about this PhD, because my similarity would be more in the writing world than journalism, because as I mentioned before, I did do journalism, but it was never really what I wanted to do. It was not my initial goal, let's say. So I was okay not doing that at some point. But the writing is what I wanted to do in terms of just analysis, commentary pieces, all of that stuff. And so that's when I started sitting with it in many ways. It was just literally me and my partner. For months in the early, as everyone knows, obviously, the early months of the pandemic, it wasn't uncommon for us not to see anyone at all, which is what happened. And so, yeah, as I said, this is when I started sitting with it, and this is when the all of those emotions, I had told myself, very similar to what you wrote, that okay, now I'm in France, but I was based like PhD wise in Switzerland, and it's going to be better. I would be able to actually I don't know, think about what happened, but daily life would be allowing me to deal with the chaos and the trauma and everything of what passed better. And I mean, it did in some ways. It was, I would say, healthier in some ways than if I was in Lebanon during the early phase of the pandemic, because probably there would be other problems there. But in other ways, it was just very, I don't know what's the word. Actually, I'm just gonna quote you because you said it much better, which is okay. This is you. I'm quoting you. To start with, I grew up surrounded by people who have never experienced the joy of peaceful tranquility, the insouciance of a summer holiday, or the option of disconnecting for a few hours a day to indulge in a variety of pastimes. I thought that this was normal. End quote. So with me, it's not as bad, I would say, because Lebanon was not, and obviously still is not as dangerous as Syria, at least for Lebanese. But there was a sense of this. I was next to one of the car bombs in 2007, I believe. Of course, the 2006 war, I was from some distance, but we experienced it, quote unquote. So there was all of these things that I took for granted growing up, that I don't know if I would say this is normal, because there's also this question of, well, what is normal? It's a big question, even in your essay. But I didn't think of it as making me completely different than, let's say, a kid growing up in where I am now, in Switzerland or in France. And it's later on, past 2 years essentially, that I really realized that there's so much that I just did not have, and just I took for granted that these things do not exist, essentially. And I'm talking about very basic things for people, let's say, who live here, like being able to use a tram or a train, or just walking, because Beirut is not very walking friendly, at least not in long distances. And I experienced this in the UK before as well. So anyway, this whole rambling is to say that I felt this lack by seeing other people not knowing that this is a lack, if you see what I mean. And so I wonder if you can talk a bit about that, because I'm referencing this because obviously you mentioned this in the essay.
No, but thank you for mentioning it, because it gives me the perfect kind of ground to set my situation in that it wasn't just about me. And had it just been about me, it would have been a very different experience. But where I was living in Syria, it was a complex situation. In Lebanon, maybe a lot of my friends were expats by nature of journalism and my work in international media and just kind of friends that I had at the time. But when I was in Syria all my life, I had never lived anywhere else. I'd only lived in Syria, and I only knew Syrians. All my friends were Syrian, all my relative, everyone in my life. Um, and again, when it comes to the most dangerous aspects of the war, I always was, living in some of the safest spots of Syria, even during the darkest years of the war, of the conflict. But as you said, we experience it in a way or another. But when you grew up and you spend all your lives not knowing what that kind of normal is, the one that is experienced in Switzerland or in France or in America, not to say that life there is perfect, for example, for everyone, of course, but nobody has it. Nobody in Syria, nobody had this kind of sense of, as we said, tranquility, or this sense of, their, and it's this thing that I see here in France, of course, the thing that, you have you have time and you have money and you have a certain, um, you know, level of resources that allow you to engage in a simple hobby, for example, or to go on holiday. And I didn't know anyone who goes on holiday in Syria, just leaves the country, for example. Maybe people go to Latakia for a weekend or for a long weekend or for a week. That's what most people would do. Of course, a city on the Syrian coast, but to travel to other countries and come back and ask you. Here in France, the question I get asked most around May or April is, what are your plans for August? Where are you traveling immediately? It's just assumed that you're going to do so. And when I was in Syria, nobody had that. And being surrounded by this kind of all these people who are overworked, who are struggling in so many ways, politically, financially, professionally, socially, in so many restraints also from society, from families, especially for people who don't necessarily conform to all of the too many things that Syrian society requires of you, whether a man or a woman or whatever you are. And that did not make me feel like I was particularly going through anything wrong, because, as you said, I had nothing to set it against. I had nothing to compare it to. And when I was in Lebanon, maybe it started to feel a little bit different, because almost all my friends had different kinds of passports, American or British or French, and were able to go back and forth. And I'd be the only one left, for example, behind, because I couldn't leave, and I was stuck in Lebanon. I could even leave Beirut or even certain neighborhoods, because I was avoiding checkpoints, and I was avoiding being asked about my passport, because I was like most Syrians, illegally, undocumented. And but what the similarity remained is that everyone was overworked. Everyone was, struggling with the work hours, with the struggle of work, because we were all journalists. We were all working on the same subjects, which are very traumatizing, even from afar, and also doing all these long hours without a break. And my first official encounter with a break, or with a work-life balance, or with any sort of, caring for your own mental health and engaging in things that aren't work. And I'm not saying just because you're passionate about your work or think that you're passionate about your work, just because you have to back in the region. And here, I saw people having that, and I wanted it for myself, and I wanted it for so many people that I know back home. And it's where I started to feel this kind of difference between what I went through and what many people elsewhere around the world go through. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, definitely does. I wrote down, this is kind of funny, but I wrote down the Shire, and I'm going to explain why now. But I took therapy while I was still in Edinburgh, in Scotland, and I was with this amazing therapist, and for a few months and everything. But obviously, then I had to leave. So we stopped and everything. But last year, I asked her if she was okay to continue online. So she said yes, and so we continued online. And at some point in one of the sessions, she noticed that I kept on referencing, fictional places like the Shire, among others, because I think very visually, and I'm terrible at describing what I think or what I feel, so I usually use comparisons, and I try and see whether that's like enough of a salad that people understand what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And I sort of told her, like, she told me, like, what do you consider a safe space, or what do you consider stability, or what do you consider of this? Because obviously we were talking a lot about all of that. I was dealing with visa issues, money issues, still am in some ways, but it's much better now. And so I told her, well, it's kind of like I picture the Shire, or I picture, I don't know if you've watched Sex Education, the Netflix series.
Yes.
Well, I picture that town kind of where it's beautiful, but it's also diverse. It's also, there's something about it that feels not real in many ways. So I picture that. I picture maybe like Hogwarts, because I read the Harry Potter books when I was younger, all of those stuff. And she said, well, this makes a lot of sense, because I was telling her all of these things as if something was wrong with me. I was saying, like, I don't understand why when I think of safety, I think of places that don't exist, you know. And she said, well, they don't, you think of these things because you didn't have them. And so you're thinking of something that doesn't exist. But in many ways, if I was picturing, like, I don't know, a stereotypical Swiss village in the mountains or whatnot, it's as fictional to me as the Shire. That's
the Shire.
Yeah, that's kind of the point. Because the Shire, for me, I wasn't necessarily, obviously it's romanticized, whatever, but I wasn't necessarily thinking of, well, the hobbits and the wizards and, you know, all of that. I was thinking of the image in my mind. Well, it's very visual, so it's from the movies more than from the books, of that description in the beginning of the book, which they also repeat in the movie, like, oh, the hobbits are, I forgot what it is, but, you know, a peaceful, whatever. They love to smoke and they love to garden and to eat and stuff like that. And I was like, well, that's nice. That's what I was thinking of. That's what I was. It's the vibe. You know, it's the emotion. It's the idea of, you know, people around you. You can just go to the pub. You can go to whatever, and more or less people are okay with one another. And that is what I realized I was missing. Now, that's not to say that, you know, I'm in Geneva now, so it's not to say that people who live here lived in the Shire or anything like that. Problems everywhere, all of these issues everywhere, but just this sense of mobility, the sense of, or the right to mobility, we might say, or the right to stability, the right to at least knowing that, well, you will have some problems, but in you know, they're not death threats, they're not Israel is gonna bomb, you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Those things are what I was craving, and I had no idea that I was craving them. I would go back to these movies. Lord of the Rings is the example I mentioned now. I watched it a lot of times growing up, like obsessively, I would say. And I would skip some scenes that I didn't really care about. So I would skip the scenes with Frodo and Sam and Gollum, because, like, well, whatever, I watched it a few times. And I would always go back to the scenes where you have a lot of people who are together. A lot of people are talking together. They're around a table, they're talking. And so it was all of these things that I was craving. And it's not like I didn't have friends. I did. My life, I would say, was relatively okay. You know, a loving family, stable household, as good as it gets in many ways. But there was this lack of stability. I guess I'm going back to that term. There was something that we had these jokes growing up, which I'm now remembering actually when I'm talking of. There was, you know, this of course, but I mentioned this for the audience. After 2005, after the assassination of Rafiq Hariri in February 14, 2005, which obviously is Valentine's Day, so that was something that kind of stuck later on. There was a series of car bombs that technically never really ended, but they're not as frequent now. And I was in school. I was 14 when Harry was assassinated, and so I that was kind of the high school period for me. And there was a period where it was really a bomb every few weeks. It felt definitely every month or so, every couple of months or so, including that one that was pretty close to where I was. So, and I just remember growing up that kids in school would joke about, well, if there's a bomb, that means there's no school tomorrow. That's what we would joke about, because there was no real conception. I mean, I knew that it's bad. You know, it's like, I know this is not good, but it's too complicated. So I simplify it to the most immediate good thing, which is no school today. And that's what I picture. That's how I remember. Oh, let's say when I remember these things, I tell myself now, well, clearly this shouldn't count as a normal childhood. But at the time, I wasn't thinking this. I only now think this in comparison to all these other things that I've seen in, kids here, let's say in Geneva or what have you, or even in TV series of movies or movies from the 90s, early 2000s, etc., etc. That's where, or that's when, because I still think about this today, it's a quasi daily thing at this point. That's when I realized that, well, this wasn't actually normal. And I know that the question of normal is very complicated. So I will ask you if you can talk a bit more about this. How do you think about this question of normality? What counts as normal? What is good normal? What is bad normal? And so on.
I mean, it's funny you should mention all of these stories resonate so much with me, especially in relation to bombings, meaning school that wouldn't happen, for example, or anything. I remember times where I would be choosing, because when I was at university, I wasn't living with my family. I was renting in Syria, and would be, when a certain neighborhood has a certain danger, or there's bombardment on that neighborhood often or something, but we would say, oh, but don't worry, it was just Howen, it was just a mortar shell, so it doesn't explode. And then the other person would be assured, oh, of course, if this is a neighborhood where only mortar shells fall, then you will be fine, because what are the odds that it will fall on you, or it will cause enough shrapnels for one of them to hit you, for example. And I also remember in October 2019 when on the first day of the Lebanon Uprising, actually, and I was there, and as a reporter, but also just watching and remembering 2011, and it was very similar. It took me back there very strongly and very emotionally, and
well, especially with some of the chants were basically the
some
same.
of the chants being the same, exactly.
Yeah.
And even some of them, they took the tune, for example, just changed the lyrics. Even Yalla Arhal Ya Bashar featured, and that's, for me, that was very, very symbolic and emotional. And my mom, who knew I was in Lebanon illegally and who knew kind of what was going on, she was watching on television all these arrests happening, and there was beating and tear gas and all of that. And I answered, and I knew I had to answer, because if I didn't, she would be worried, and I would never see the end of it. But I answered, and I spoke to her, of course, in my Syrian dialect, and the first thing she said to me, while tear gas is falling on us and security forces are attacking us, is, why are you talking in Syrian next to Lebanese people, for example, or why are you talking your dialect? This will cause. And we always have this kind of strange way to measure what counts as normal, what counts as dangerous, what counts as a risk to take or not risky. And the things that maybe we're used to tear gas, and we were used to just to security forces clamping down more than certain acts of racism, for example, or certain acts of xenophobia. And the normal, as I view it today, it very much has to do with my own situation. And it's one of the things that are currently preventing me from doing journalism in general. There was some kind of misunderstanding by some people who read the essay. I did not say I'm quitting journalism as a whole. I did not make this statement. I said I've stopped doing Syria, and even that, it's for now. I won't say I will never ever again work on Syria, but I won't soon. But I didn't say I intentionally dropped journalism. No, as a matter of fact, I was, I would love to write more and write about different themes and places. I would love to experience covering France, for example, and or Europe or whatever. And but one thing that currently is preventing me from going back to pursuing that is I need rest, and I've been resting. I wanted to take the job that I currently have. First of all, because I think it's a good job with a good organization and an NGO, and second of all, just because it came with a routine, and I found it somewhat funny because when I was in my university, kind of snubbing every other career and field of study, and boasting about my choice of journalism, I would say to anyone else, you chose routine. You chose to wake up at the same hour every day, to finish working at the same time every day, and then, go do the same thing. Whereas I chose a career that will make me see different things and different people, and it's very exciting. It's very
I'm a
different.
liberated human being.
Exactly. And now my ideal situation, my normal, is to seek the most boring routine that you can ever find, and it's what I have now, and it's what I cherish most, and what I cherished most since the beginning of 2021, is that I have this job. I wake up a couple of hours before I begin working, and I make myself breakfast. I work. I go out to take a lunch break outside, and then come back, and then finish working, and then um, either sit down and read, or go to a cafe, or go meet a friend, and then go back and sleep early and wake up early. And I've loved that, more than anything, and I've been enjoying, cherishing every hour of this routine um, every day. And I think just the idea of you also, I'm so grateful I have. And it's funny to see how low the standards are, because when I got this job, and I would call everyone and say, "Oh my God, this organization is offering me a contract, a staff job. It's an actual employee." And many people would be surprised, because they work in different sectors. Like, isn't this how it's supposed to be? Isn't this what being employed by someone means? And I was not believing it. And a company is signing an actual contract with me, and calling me a staff employee. That I could never dream of that with media organizations. And so, even though this may sound normal to some people, it was not normal to me at all. And it was, I almost felt grateful for that, even though many people were telling me, "You shouldn't feel grateful. This is what you deserve as an employee." And now, what I have now is maybe one day I'll go back to being bored of it. Maybe, I never know how things fluctuate. I mean, I'm sure one day I will miss the grind, and I will miss doing. I love journalism. I still do. And but just being able to have a certain level of control over your work, your life, knowing where work should actually be placed, regardless of how passionate you are about it, within your life as well, is I think very important. Especially as I, year after year, I realize, how futile many of the things we do are, and how unimportant many of the things that we used to think are important really are in real life. And that also kind of, has tamed me a little bit over the years.
Like Twitter fights.
Yes.
So I wrote down a few things as well, but I'm gonna see if I can remember why. You mentioned how even when we knew that bad things were happening, so let's say bombs were falling over a certain neighborhood, there was still a knowledge for most people of which area was safer than another area, right? And for me, that was the 2006 experience in Lebanon, because I wasn't in Dahiyeh or in the south or in Dibaa. So for the most part, people knew what I was 15, so I didn't know anything. But people around me, I remember my mother and just people who are older, knew which area will be more at risk than others. And our area, which is like in Mount Lebanon and everything, wasn't at risk. And indeed, nothing happened where we were. We would feel the bombs because, well, for people who don't know, it's literally the hills overlooking Beirut. So like the I don't know what you call it, like the vibration or whatever. We would feel them, and we would see them, of course, because again, it's a hill, so you can see Beirut under you, so to speak. But at no point did I don't ever remember thinking I am in danger. And obviously, this is something that when I started a university at the UB in Beirut, that's the American University of Beirut, for those who don't know. And I met people, and that was just a few years after, and I met people who were from the south, or were from Dahi, or were from the east, or whatever. I kind of knew this, but it kind of hit me that, well, we didn't have the same experience. For them, it was actually terror, and it was actually most of them had to leave, if everyone had to leave, etc., etc. And that was the first spark, if you want, of, well, my life wasn't the same as other people. It's kind of like many people in university have that realization, I suppose. The only reason I'm mentioning all of this, I won't get into that too much, is just to acknowledge that the experiences, even during war, are not all the same. And there's always this tendency to homogenize everything, etc., etc. So that's one thing. The other thing, two things I'll briefly mention, just because we brought it up, is the chance. and I'll mention it because I wrote an article for Shadow Mag, which I'll link in the description, on the chants in Lebanon. It's like I look at the Lebanese uprising through its chants, I think, or something like that. And I made a point to mention the Syrian ones, as I'm calling them, like the ones that were influenced from Syria and everything. Because one thing, which links to the other thing that you were saying, is that although we're using Syrian chants, Syrians were not safe among us. And I know this because I had Syrian friends with me. And I ended up writing an article for Jumhuriya, and I opened up while you were talking, because Syrian melancholy in Lebanon's revolution, with a Syrian friend, and who was talking and writing about the same stuff that you just mentioned, like the accent, the dialect shouldn't be the same. So we would actually speak in English, me and her, because she wasn't able to do a Lebanese dialect accent. So we're just speaking English,
Yeah.
and that's fine.
It's harder than one would think. It's even though they're very similar.
Yeah. Because you only need like one slip, and it's just something that at least many Lebanese would know. And the last thing you mentioned about boredom is I can't describe. I mean, I think you would know this, but many people listening may not know. I can't describe how much I appreciate boredom, how much I actually seek it out sometimes. Like if I feel like I'm being too busy, I'm gonna say no. Right now, I'm gonna do literally not a single thing, and I'm gonna look at this. I'm gonna stare at the screen stare at the wall for all I care, and do not a single thing until something comes to my mind. And now, okay, I'm gonna read a bit. It's gonna be now a downtime, as they call it. It's just calm time and everything.
Absolutely.
Well, okay, it is linked to what you already talking about, which is this the importance of a routine. And so I would like us, if that's okay, to talk a bit more about that, because it links to something that we will come back to in the end, which is I listened to the podcast that you did with Karim Shaheen on New Lines, and you mentioned reading Seneca, and so I want to kind of actually get into that a bit. But before that, talk a bit more about the routines. How did you establish them? Did you sort of impose it on yourself? Like, okay, right now I'm just going to do this, and regardless of the itch to check online or to whatever, I'm not going to put everything aside. Like, how did it come about?
I think the fact that I waited until, or only realized that I've reached a point where I can't do this anymore, on Syria in general, but even honestly, even on the news for a certain period, realizing it way too late helped me instate all of these rules. So when it happened, I had just lost a job again in journalism and was fully freelancing for the first time. I wasn't used to being a freelancer, 100%, because I was jumping from full-time job to another. And I was here in France, of course, and it was, when sometimes when, especially when we were new at freelancing, there's always this fear that you won't, and I don't think it ever goes away, that, maybe you're getting some offers now, but in 3 months or in 4 months, you won't get anything. So you have to take everything you get now, even if it's too much, because you never know. And I was considering myself, luckily I'm getting things now, but I have to say yes to all of them, because I otherwise, who can guarantee? And I, got myself into big trouble professionally, because I accepted way more than I can actually do, way more than I actually should do. It affected me personally very heavily, and it was lockdown, by the way, and it was the worst lockdown, I think, because we went through the first lockdown, which for me, of course, everyone had a different experience. For me, the first lockdown was fine. The second for me was really, really hard, and it was the longer one, and it was the darker one, because it was in winter. It was the colder one. And it was when all of this was happening also inside me and professionally as well. And I was working all the time, and I was making okay money at the time, and at least compared to what I was earning before that. And when I made that decision, when I realized I can't really keep doing this, there were even some things that I was doing that were earning me what we would call easy money. It didn't require, it would be a company or an organization far, far away from Syria. And they would think that, what I can do with a little bit of knowledge of the language and of the context and my experience, I think I could do it easily, just in terms of logistically, whereas they would think it's something that they couldn't do without me. And so that would, not take too much of my time, but also for them would constitute something that's actually valuable. And I even had to end those projects. I wanted to end everything. And I was on a podcast actually. I was hosting a podcast on Syria. I joined for one season, and I loved it. I loved the team, and I also went. I also left. I waited until the season was over, and I didn't continue. Um, and then I found myself doing it automatically. My hands were automatically going, disabling notifications, deleting. I used to use Telegram for news channels a lot and for notifications, and you needed to contact certain members of the opposition in Syria, for example. I deleted that. I disabled notifications from many places. I started tailoring my Twitter, for example, which I use way too much, but which we also have to, because I only started to get actually serious offers and work opportunities, and when I started actively using Twitter, and I started to unfollow certain accounts and mute others. Sorry to anyone to whom I did this, but it was just about ones that are very dedicated to Syria, very dedicated to the things that I exactly wanted to avoid looking at. Now my Twitter is all full of poetry and Renaissance and antiquity and languages, and it's quite a different place. And I was doing all of these changes, and I actually, so all this to say is, what if I had tried to do this, for example, when I was in Beirut, when I was in the midst of it, and when I had these full-time jobs covering Syria and Lebanon, and I just decided, to try out a system where I also balance it with my life and kind of try to ease. First of all, I didn't have the option, because if something happens at midnight and I am not there to work on it, and that's a problem, and that's and they would tell you, if you don't want to do this, you shouldn't have become a journalist. And I won't say I completely disagree. I mean, there needs to be certain ways of compensating, for example, or taking into account people's mental health or all that. But yes, we know that we don't have control over the news when things happen. But if I had tried it, I think even my body and mind would not have collaborated with me. I was in the midst of it, and I wanted to be doing all of these things, and I was very, very much involved, and I hadn't experienced what it could look like to be outside of it and in a routine that's quieter and more sustainable. And here, I think it was very easy. So mainly had to do with me stopping to look at news. Until today, I only look at things that are either the ones that directly affect me, for example, COVID news in France, for example, or certain travel restrictions or all of that, or those that concern a lot of my loved ones and friends, and that will include some news about Syria and about Lebanon, of course, because a lot of the people I love are still back there. And I say still, of course, because this is the kind of the perpetual state that we're in always when we're from those places, and trying to limit my knowledge on the other. So I still get every now and then, some friends used to count on me, especially my Syrian non-journalist friends, not just the Syrians, but the ones who were completely out of it. They have different jobs. They're used to coming to me, hey, what's going on in Deir ez-Zor today? What's this news we're hearing about this person? And I have no idea. I actually have no idea. I have some friends with whom I used to work. They would say, can we hit you up, chat about something that has to do with Syria? We swear we won't ask you to work. It's just, to pick your brains. And again, I appreciate this. But I really, first of all, I don't know what's been happening in Syria apart from the very major headlines. And second of all, even those short discussions are actually affecting me. And this is where you start feeling it, because maybe 1 week before I made that decision, Syria was all I was doing. And it seemed not fine, but I was doing it. I'm able to do it. I was writing a weekly newsletter, co-writing a weekly newsletter on Syria, very detailed. And I was writing, contributing to articles, writing full-on articles whenever I'm allowed to do so, and participating in research, even translating. Sometimes I would take on a translation gig just for a bit of extra money, and that would be about Syria as well. And after I took that decision immediately, it's as if I can't even read a tweet about Syria. And when I read a tweet about Syria, a very short text, I feel the physical toll and the emotional toll of that on me. And this is still going on until today. So I'm still actively avoiding it. And I kind of feel bad about it, a little bit. But this is how things, I guess I pushed for so long in a certain extreme, and now I need an opposite extreme to kind of tame it. And I'm sure it'll only go on for a while, but I would actively, um, even delete some pages. I mean, I don't use Facebook now very often, but whenever I do, I see all the pages that come on my feed, when I used to use it for work a lot. And I still use it for work now, just to run my organization's page and all of that. And I actively go and unlike and unfollow so many places just because I don't want to see these things appearing on my feed. They're important. They're very important. People should be seeing them, but I can't.
You mentioned Twitter. I wanted, if it's okay, to mention it a bit more, because in the journalism world, it is their main application. It is their main website. It's where a lot of politicians are. Obviously, he who shall not be named was very active on Twitter up until last year. Up until last year, and it was just the thing that many journalists really, it became I would almost as important as making a salary, and in some cases more important than making a salary. And this is certainly my case. There was a lot of time where getting a certain amount of you might call it social capital was more urgent on a day-to-day basis than getting paid for a certain article. And this is where it was actually damaging on just career-wise or whatever wise, right? Because I did not have the time to write a opinion piece for X publication, let's say, while at the same time covering what was happening on a daily basis, because it was happening literally every 5 minutes. Luckily, I managed to write a few things. I think I wrote 3 or 4. They're more like essays rather than articles during the uprising, so October, November, December, more or less 2019. So luckily that happened, but more could have happened. I had lots of offers. This is the getting a lot of attention because of coverage means that a lot of people also want you to write for them, of course. And in theory, I could have done it, but I wasn't able to let. It was kind of the way I think about it. And sorry for the rambling, but the way I think about it is it's a different temporality required. Like I need to sit down, of course, and write, which means in order to write about this very urgent thing, I need to put this very urgent thing aside. And I wasn't really able to do it. So for better or worse, probably for worse, I wasn't able to do it. And I would definitely blame, and I've thought about this much more since, the specific ways in which Twitter functions in the journalistic world, that it does have its pros, but because it has its pros, those pros tend to come with a lot of cons. The baggage tend to be very toxic overall, I would say, because in the short term, there's almost always a reason to be on that site. But in the long term, it can cause burnout, exhaustion, everything, polarization, toxicity, blah, 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 all of those things that I think many people already know. So I'm just kind of curious, and this is just kind of for my personal interest, and listeners will have to indulge me because this is my podcast. How did you deal with Twitter? How would you describe your relationship, and maybe Facebook as well, but you mentioned Twitter especially?
It's an amazing thing, isn't it? Because I remember in 2019, starting 2017, I've had a Twitter account, I don't know, since I was a kid, and it wasn't active. I did not have a single original tweet until actually the first tweet was about the uprising in Lebanon in October 2019.
Okay.
And before that, I didn't have any tweet. And before that, I was going through this thing with friends and colleagues where sometimes I would say something, or I would send a message, or express myself in a certain way, or talk about something, and they would say, "You should tweet this. You should tweet about this." And I would find it always the most bewildering response. I mean, it's I'm saying this to you, or I'm sharing this here. Why would I? And it often come from journalists.
Yeah.
And I couldn't understand what this kind of bosses would be telling me that I should be on Twitter more, that I should tweet more, which I also found amazing. And and I didn't understand this until I actually started tweeting, gave into the pressure, and then got sucked, because I wasn't even also looking at it very much. I hadn't been sucked into the whole thing yet. And then it all happened, and it happened very quickly, because also when I went to France and lockdown happened, I was just on Twitter all the time. And I was sucked into it. But then the day I started tweeting, or let's not exaggerate, but the week I started tweeting, I started to be recognize. And even though I'd already been doing journalism for a few years, I'd been working, already exactly 2 years for a big newspaper, international newspaper. Lots of people were saying, "Wait, who's this guy now suddenly talking about Syria?" Or no, I'm not suddenly talking about Syria. I've been talking about Syria for a bit, but I've only just started tweeting, which I realized for many people
It's the only thing that matters.
constitutes exactly. And I started getting DMs about being interviewed on a radio station or appearing on a TV station to talk about something, or jobs. I have my current job because of Twitter, and it's suddenly this indispensable thing, whether we like it or not, when we're working in these domains. And you can't, it's very hard. I mean, I salute anyone who uses it just in the right way, because it's hard to go on that website and not encounter so many other things other than what you went there looking for, be it your work, or be it your increasing your knowledge about something, or you expressing for fandom to someone who's on it, or anything of the sort, making friends. And I actually made some good friends on Twitter. But I can't place my finger on a specific obvious reason on how it did it, but I'm sure that Twitter also affected my mental state over the couple of years that I've used it. And now I don't use it as much as, and I just said, I have been really working hard on tailoring the content I've been seeing, except that they seem to have this new thing where they suggest interests, or they suggest things that you need to see, and it's completely the opposite of what I want to be seeing.
Yeah, they took this from Facebook.
And it was, and it was, I mean, compared to some of my other colleagues, what they had, especially women, the kind of the hatred that they got because of their work, and the vile kind of campaigns against them, especially by pro-Russia bots and trolls. It was awful, and I never saw any of that. There were maybe 2 or 3 occasions where I saw like a glimpse of it, including once when I wrote an article for the Washington Post about the crimes committed by the mercenaries of Turkey in Syria, in the incursion into northeastern Syria, and the awful crime that they were committing there, and lots of people were attacking me about it. And then another time I remember was when it was the death of Sarah Hijazi, and I tweeted a lot about that because that touched me so. And I also kind of, apparently a hashtag I used, or a tweet I used, kind of appeared on the troll network of targets, and it kind of also showed me a taste of how awful this place could be, but it could also be a wonderful place. And the best example I have in mind is my essay, my Newlands essay, which we've been talking about. Until the moment the essay was published, I wasn't quite sure about it. And when I saw the overwhelming response that's still continuing until now, I was absolutely touched by it. Not one tweet was, every tweet was supportive and understanding, and they also made me realize so many things. I mean, I got so many messages from Hong Kong, for example, from people saying, actually, we experience the same thing over here. And the same from certain countries in Africa, in Asia, in places that I've never been to, or I don't really know how journalism works there. And it kind of, people were talking about it, and I was being, asked questions about it. And I heard a couple of stories, from here and there, where it I won't say made change, but it was in someone's mind, when they were doing something, and it was kind of, I wouldn't be so ambitious to dream that this article would lead to any actual change, but I think just opening the debate every now and then, it's very useful, and Twitter helped me do that, of course.
No, for sure. By the time this episode comes out, because I'm preparing a blog post, so it might already be out by then, but I'm not sure. But I'm writing about my experience specifically with Twitter, because right now it became the only platform I use. There is the Instagram page for this podcast. It's not very active, but other than that, I'm not on either Instagram or on Facebook. And I deleted Facebook under well, actually, I just mentioned it. It's not really a secret, but I'm mentioned in the Facebook files, the stuff that were released. I forgot the name of the whistleblower a few months ago, because on Facebook, it was related to Syria because I had gotten a lot of death threats from well, we would call them Assadists in English, or Hezbollah supporters. And it was the usual stuff, report, complaint, blah blah blah. There was no response, and in the end, it was kind of overwhelming. So I deleted, at the time, what was the page of my blog, which was called Hummus for Thought.
Mm-hmm.
And so I deleted that page, and not too long after, I think a few months after, I deleted my personal account as well on Facebook. So I ended up using only Twitter. And as you said, there are absolutely positives to that website, and figuring out a way to hack it in the sense of in the same way that it hacks your attention span, but to actually reverse hack it in some ways, to use it for only the good without too much of the bad, let's say, to be very simple about it. So anyway, that's something that I'm thinking about, and I might write something about it. Sarah Higazi, the only thing I'll say about this is that I interviewed Hamid Sinno of Mashwa Layla on this podcast last year or 2 years, I don't remember.
Oh wow! Okay, I didn't. Yeah.
So I interviewed him, and of course, for those who don't know, so Sarah Higazi was a queer leftist Egyptian activist in exile in Canada, and unfortunately, she died by suicide a couple of years ago. And the reason why Hamid Sinno is relevant here is that it was at his concerts, at the concert of Mashwa Layla, of which he is the lead singer, in Egypt, in Cairo, that Sarah and a bunch of other people waved a pride flag, the LGBTQ plus flag, and she was the subject of horrific campaigns, other than being arrested, of horrific campaigns online, abuses, etc., etc. And when she did get asylum in Canada, but it was still a bit too much. So I won't say too much about it because, in that episode we do mention it. And the very last thing is that there is a reason why the very first episode of this podcast was on Hong Kong, the very, very first episode.
Oh, okay.
And I've done a number of them since, and I've written for Lausanne, which is this Hong Kong like kind of a left decolonial space media outlet, specifically actually exploring the similarities and differences between Hong Kong and Lebanon. And there are some ridiculous similarities from especially the time of the 60s and the 70s, when Lebanon was like, some leftist intellectuals were using this very ridiculous analysis of Lebanon being between Hanoi and Hong Kong and stuff like that. So there was these parallels that we explored. So I'll mention all of this in the description. But if it's okay with you, because I kind of went a bit all over the place, which I tend to do on this podcast. But if it's okay with you to talk a bit more about Lebanon, specifically from your experience in Lebanon. A lot of people know that things aren't exactly good about in the sense of like the lives of Syrian refugees in Lebanon, but the specifics I think, I would guess, aren't very well known. So if you can talk a bit about yours.
Yeah, of course. So to set the scene, for those who don't know, Lebanon is famous or infamous for being one of the few countries that did not sign the International Refugee Convention. So they don't have actual asylum processes in place. You can't ask for asylum in Lebanon and become a refugee recognized by the Lebanese state.
And they don't call them refugees in the government. They call them migrants, exactly, basically, or displaced or whatever.
Yeah. Or as I think Basile once suggested, it was duyuf, guests, or and so there were many issues that people would face. Lots of them financial, because the fact that you would require, like many people in Lebanon, Syrian refugees go there and they don't have documents. They're undocumented migrants. But even some of the documented ones, their documents come a lot from their employers, from their Lebanese employers, who, through the kafala system, have complete control over this person. So they underpay them, they overwork them, and they can threaten them, and even it goes even to sexual assault and actual kind of almost torture reaching methods, and the Syrian cannot do, not just Syrian, cannot do anything about it, because their kafala, their residency is tied to this person. This person decides basically their destiny in Lebanon.
Yeah, because if they leave, they automatically become illegals.
Exactly. So you can't just change, and you can't just quit that job. It's far more complicated, and you also need that money, and you're not being paid well. And it also had a funny system of who gets to get this kafala, even who doesn't. And there are many things that I was lucky enough to skip and not face. I never had a Lebanese employer. I didn't have a Lebanese employer, for example. I was working for international media, and that was tricky to navigate legally. But I wasn't registered basically legally in Lebanon, because I did not have a residency permit and I did not have a work permit, and there wasn't a path for me to even try to get one. So I was willing, and I went there, and I had a 1 month entry visa, and I spent that 1 month panicking and trying to do whatever I can through the means, the official means, through wastas, through talking to someone, and it would just not work. And I wasn't very well connected in Lebanon at the time, and even until the moment I left, the friendships I made, the relationships I made weren't with the partisans or the people who can do these kinds of things over the Am. It was very difficult, and it was impossible, actually, not just very difficult. So lots of people would meet me and be surprised, how can you be working with the Financial Times, for example, and not get a way to get a residency permit or a work permit? And it's actually weirdly the other way around. There was no way the FT or any other media organization could have got me. They don't have, the state doesn't provide them with any route to do that. And yet somehow it could be, for example, if you're doing something very local, or you're working, I think they had 3 categories of Syrians at some point. The only ones that could get an actual work permit: you have to be a concierge, for example, of a building, or you have to work on land or in construction, menial work generally, and they kind of make you do that and then give you the kafala system. And I didn't go through that. And I was lucky, to be employed by someone who didn't take advantage of my situation in that sense. I was paid just a regular salary and all of that. But I also was lucky to be friends with expats and all of this. But I was living in a place. I mean, Lebanon also has a problem of racism against, kind of blanket racism against people from so many different regions and countries, and especially with Syria. And you add to it the refugee crisis, and you add to it the history of the Syrian invasion of Lebanon. You add to it, the kind of identity struggle between the two countries, and all of that. It could sometimes be an environment that's not entirely hospitable or friendly to people from Syria. And I faced that a lot. And my problem wasn't from the people, for example, that I was dealing with. Even the people whom I would interact with, and initially they'd give me a racist response. They would later also be confused about how to kind of, interact with me, and they would show certain nice aspects of themselves, and it's just something that's happening beyond their control. And it's something that's stuck with them, as you said, exactly. But then there's the racism of the state, which was a whole other thing, and which was the main issue for me. And another confusing thing was, where does Lebanon stand on the matter of deporting Syrians, catching Syrians and sending them back to Syria? Because I wasn't the only Syrian living there illegally. I was one of hundreds of thousands. And clearly Lebanon knows this. And had they wanted to kind of put everyone in a bus and send them back to Syria, they would have done it a long time ago. There were some reasons preventing them from doing this. But from the way they're talking and the way they're behaving, it seemed like any day they will start doing this. And they did it to a lot of people. And by 2018, 2019, they were doing it increasingly. And I was thinking, I'm also, maybe I'm not, immediately accessible by the Lebanese authorities, living in a certain kind of Beirut and kind of, being surrounded. I would think about all the possible scenarios, for example, where they think that because I work for international media and know these kind of powerful journalists and diplomats, they would rather not, do that for me. Or would they actually, because I would think about it also, because I'm writing all these articles that anger Hezbollah and, the Lebanese president and his party, and of course the Syrian regime, their allies. and I'm just there and I'm living illegally. So if one day someone gets angry at me, reads an article and reads my name, who's that, and realize that I live in Lebanon illegally, which wasn't very hard to find out, they can just throw me back to the Syrian regime, and they don't have to say that it was about me, my journalism. They can say, oh, it was just because, he was living here illegally and working illegally. We can do this to him.
Mm.
So I actually at some point started mapping checkpoints to know where I can go and where I can't go in Beirut and in Lebanon, because every time I left, and granted, I was mostly leaving to go, I would go out, I would go to bars, and I would go to restaurants, and I'd see my friends. I had a very nice life there that many people couldn't enjoy. But every time I left, I would have this fear that, if I'm asked to show a passport, if I'm asked to show documents, what could happen? And this was it's funny you mentioned the Shire earlier, because this makes me think about what Bilbo says about at some point is when he says it's a funny business leaving your home, and you never know where you might be swept off to, and in that case I could have been swept off to very bad places, to Isengard and beyond, and I didn't want that to happen, and I didn't want this to happen at all. And this fear, so nothing bad actually happened to me, as in, arrest or obviously deportation or that. But I had to live 3 years with every day thinking that this is the day when it happens.
Yeah, that's the thing. So yeah, I mentioned this in previous episodes as well, so I won't dwell on this too much. But the way I had an episode at the end of December with Sharia Talerani on Syrian prison literature. And one thing that we were talking about was the nature of threats and how threats can, how we can calculate risks, let's say, on a daily basis. And I mentioned the example of how I haven't been back since February 2020 because I've had these threats specifically by Hezbollah and even by the state at some point. But the way this functioned for me, and I'm saying this as a Lebanese, is that I could never know whether these threats have ever expired. There was no way for me to know that Hezbollah are like, now, well, you're fine, you can come back. Because those threats are rarely formal; they're usually informal. You sort of know them from connections that you have or from people that told you or something like this, and it's not always clear to know exactly what would happen that day. Because, for example, with you at the checkpoint, you can go there, you say there's a joke that if you say bonsoir or bonjour, they don't stop you. So you can say that and they don't stop you and you pass by. Or you can say salam alaikum and they stop you. That you could say something, and maybe the guy feels like he's in a good mood today and he says whatever, pass by. He's sick of all of these cars, so he just says pass by. Or actually he has a quota to fill for the day and he's going to be a dick about it. And some of them do that, and we know this. We know some checkpoints are worse than others because they're underpaid or they're all of those different things. And of course, as a the main difference between the two of us is that there was no deportation threat in my case. There wasn't obviously any of these things in my case, and I wasn't living in Beirut anyway. I was living, as I mentioned, in Mount Lebanon. So there was always, even psychologically, the fact that okay, now I left Beirut, I'm fine because I'm going up. And so there was always this psychological thing as well for me. There's this Kurdish saying, obviously, no friends but the mountains, that I kind of I understand it in some instinctual sense. And this is another thing that came out in the sessions of therapy. But this is something that is not easy to talk, is not easy to explain, because it doesn't seem coherent to myself either. Like in my head, it's like, well, you're under threat because you've done X, Y, or Z, and so you have to leave or you have to stop doing X, Y, or Z. And sometimes that is the case, of course, but a lot of the time it just isn't. A lot of the time it's, as I said, you understand your vulnerabilities, and so okay, I can go to this pub, I can go to this area, I can go to this restaurant or whatever. If I'm with some friends, I'm safer than if I'm not with them, etc., etc. And it made me think of an episode I did with Musa Okwonga. He's a Berlin-based English writer. of Ugandan origins, and it's relevant to the story because in Berlin, as a black man, he knows places that he simply cannot go, and he did not immediately know this, but he knew this from some friends of his who would tell him, come. I forgot the example that he gave. It's the last. I did 3 episodes with him. It's the last episode, so people can look it up if they want. They would tell him, like, come to my concert or come to whatever. But then once he realized what the area of Berlin was, he would say, well, I just can't go there. It's really that simple. And so it's this mental map that essentially one forms at the end of the day of certain places you can go and certain places you cannot go, and certain times as well. Like, certain places you can go in the morning and late at night maybe, but not during the day or whatever it is. I wanted to ask you something, if that's okay, of it's more of a well, it's a vague question anyway, but did you feel some guilt, or whether it's survivor's guilt, whether it's what's that other word, imposter syndrome, all of those stuff, when you decided to stop, if decided is really the right term for this, but when you decided to stop writing about Syria?
I did, yes.
Okay.
I did, and part of me still does. And rationally, there are so many valid justifications that I give to myself, of course, why I shouldn't, and also what so many friends and people told me. But yes, because I think, given that we know that the state of international coverage of Syria and our region, how it's looking today, and it's not looking perfect. I was a small component of that coverage for Syria at one point, and I was managing to do something. And even despite all the constraints, I was managing to add something. Maybe if I'm allowed a certain insight to an article that someone else is writing, I can at least kind of make sure a certain nuance, if it's missing, I make sure to add it and bring it to the table. And that role, even though it was professionally and mentally and kind of in many ways financially not really satisfying for me, at least not after a few years of doing it, it was me doing something that I don't want to say not many people can do, because that would sound like I'm boasting, or I'm saying I have this certain quality that nobody else has. It's absolutely not. It's just, given that unfortunately few people from the region and few people who know are managing to gain that access, which needs also a lot of privilege in the first place, which I had to get into. And then I started worrying about growth within that company. But so I did feel that, I asked myself, I had some people would go to me to know about certain things. And a newsletter I once worked on, was read by decision makers and was read by people who worked in diplomacy and in big NGOs and intergovernmental organizations and all of that. But I also need to know that, I'm not the only one, and there are so many good journalists out there doing their jobs, and it wouldn't be of use, neither to me, neither to Syria, neither to anyone, if I had kept going on and I completely collapsed and I couldn't be good, for anything, not for that and not for anything else. And I know, knowing this kind of comforts me, and knowing my size in the bigger picture, which is very small, of course, also comforts me. And so that guilt is fading away a little bit, especially as I see that very competent journalists from the region, but also from elsewhere around the world, are doing an excellent work, and we're always having more journalists. I think that soon we'll have actually another international media correspondent covering Syria and the region, who's going to be from the region, and I'm very happy about this. It hasn't been announced yet, but it's really it's comforting to know that, and I feel I also felt safe that being here in France now, far away, and being able to do other things and engage in other things, I can take a break. And then, as I say at the end of that, I say maybe I'll get a second wind one day, and I would be happy to grasp it if I do.
Well, speaking of international journalists from the region, obviously Karim Shaheen, when he was still at the Guardian, I interviewed him about when he went to Syria. That's a couple of years ago now, I think. But I really think this is it is a very healthy way of looking at it. And I will say that the reason why, because I still think about that, and I do feel it from time to time, but less so, the survivor's guilt, well, I say this, but it depends on good days and bad days. Is the reason why I have a healthier approach to it than I did in the past is because around 2015 to around 2018 or so, I was telling this to Syrian friends. Like, I was telling Syrian friends the stuff that one should tell oneself, essentially. Like, it's not your fault. You can't control. You can't do everything. There are other people who will cover. Focus on your safety, mental health, all of those stuff. And obviously, it's always easier to give advice than to actually apply it. So it took me some time to be as fair to myself, if you want, as I was asking them to be fair towards others. But maybe someone listening to this is would find some solace in this. Like there is a way out of this tunnel, is what I'm saying. So okay, before getting into the book section, kind of like winding down, you, as I mentioned before, you mentioned on the New Line podcast, which is pretty good, on how you really got into reading about Stoic philosophy and stuff like that. So if you can talk a bit about not just that, but anything that you feel like really helped you go through the process, let's say, and then we'll have a nice segue and talk about books, if that's okay.
So I always loved reading, and I as cliche as it sounds, but it's really true in my case. Books are my best friends, and we would fall in and out. Sometimes I would fail at committing to reading. Sometimes it would go 2 years with me doing horribly at reading, including the Beirut years in general were very bad for my reading just because of the rhythm and everything. But being here, the slower rhythm, lockdown, all of these things kind of helped me settle back into reading at a very fast pace, but also very kind of enrich and increase my knowledge and read books that I've never read before, but also reread some of the books that I've been wanting to revisit, and I've been scared because they're big commitments. And I'm not I'm not a subscriber to Stoicism myself, but I had, before I left Syria, I would used to read Marcus Aurelius's Meditations a lot, and then I fell out of this. But I've always had a fascinating. I'm actually obsessed a little bit with Greek and Roman histories, and not necessarily as a fan, because there are so many ugly aspects to those histories, but even that, seeing all of this kind of the whole picture together, and including the philosophy and the literature, and it got me to discovering the lives of certain people that I found to be very interesting. And one of them is Seneca. And before even Seneca's Stoicism, it was just the story of this man, which I got to read more about in a book. I'll take advantage and mention it now because it's not on my list of 3 books. But there was a book called Dying Every Day, Seneca at the Court of Nero. And the author will forgive me for forgetting their name at the moment. It escapes me, but it kind of, Seneca had an interesting life because he was a Stoic, and he was advising, he was talking about the unimportance of wealth and earthly pleasures and all of that, kind of, but while at the same time being very, very, very rich and powerful, to the extent that it's indirectly attributed to him that when there was a revolution in Britain against the Roman Empire, historians say that what might have triggered that revolution was Seneca asking people to pay, who were in the UK, what's now the UK, to pay him back. Because so this kind of enormous money that people in Britain owed him started a revolution. This is just one and he was very close because he was Nero's teacher. And at the same time, you read his works and his philosophy, and it's very interesting. I mean, he talks about labor. He was also sarcastic. He was funny, and he would talk about labor in very kind of strong and sharp sentences. One of the funny ones was labor is not a good thing. Labor non bonum est. What is a good thing? The hate of labor. and it's all the thing. And these started coming to me. I was reading his moral essays, which I managed to find in a nice kind of Loeb edition, and during lockdown, and I was feeling so much relating to all of that, where labor should be placed in my life. And there was a lot of debate, like was he being a hypocrite because he's saying all these things, but also, or was he actually experiencing such a pure kind of, because we can't really know, because he was very wealthy and he was talking about the unimportance of these things, but he never said that you should actively avoid these things, for example. So he maybe it was to him that he can have them at the same time, but he can also keep his philosophy. And of course, we can never enter his mind, and know exactly what's going on there. It was different times, but it was first century AD. But Seneca was a good friend, and in general, reading, long walks, and of course, whenever that was possible, because lockdown in France included also a limited distance, a maximum distance of 1 kilometer at some point. Long walks and just kind of a rediscovered appreciation, devout appreciation to art and history and philosophy and literature. And by the way, I almost never am reading, for example, books about Syria or about the region. Even when I was still working on it, I always read. I love literature. I love poetry. I love ancient history. And I think it's all the literature I read, for example, was written before World War One. I think because it's kind of, I want to escape from the world we live in, with its enforced connectivity, with its devices and technology and all of its problems, to kind of a simpler world. It wasn't so simple, but to kind of a different place, because I'm not utterly satisfied with the place I am in now. And relying on these have really helped me. And I also discovered audiobooks, which I'd never done before, and I started doing that on my walks, for example, or like when I'm sitting in the park or something, and I just want to look around, and then I'd go back and read some more from a book I have at home, and that kind of helped me get through it. In addition, of course, to the support of friends that I'm lucky to have, even if not near me physically, because I also arrived just with lockdown. I mean, in February 2020, so that was making things hard.
Awesome. Well, thanks a lot for that. This was just kind of indulging me.
Of course.
Tab, okay, let's get into the book section then. What are 3 books that you would recommend to our listeners, and just if you can briefly say why?
Yeah. So I actually altered my suggestions as we were talking. The first alteration was when you mentioned boredom, because I agree with you completely. And I remember reading an essay about boredom, how important it is, how much we miss it now. Those gaps we used to have in our days when we would just be bored, and now we just look at our phones, and how it used to be a good, it motivates creativity, and kind of, it was very useful. And I wanted to kind of pursue that in a certain way. And I started by taking action, and I was still in Lebanon, and I went on a 10-day kind of solitary holiday without my phone, without my laptop, without any friends, and just sat at home at an apartment that my friend lent to me. He wasn't there, and was walking around. I was in the mountains, and it was beautiful. And during that holiday, I read Crime and Punishment for the first time. And since then, Dostoevsky has been the only, not just the best, but the only author that would have such a magnificent and overpowering effect on me whenever I read him, that every time I finish a book by him, or sometimes just a chapter, I would lie down in bed for hours and just thinking about it and feeling even the physical effect of his work, because he's someone who understood life and he understood people, and went to places where many people didn't want to go, but also many people tried and failed, and he just managed. And he describes the journey to getting there, and describes those depths in a way that I personally have not seen with any other author. And even though it's a cliche of a title, but I know that not many people, or many people haven't read it. But Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, I think in my life was a turning point. I think I entered a new phase of my development as a human being when I read that book, and I do recommend that everyone else reads it, along with really all of Dostoevsky. The second book is something that I think also very close to home to me, is The Sorrows of Young Werther by Goethe, which is interesting to our discussion, even in a way. It's a novel. It's an epistolary novel, which is a form of literature that I really like. And when I read it the first time, I went on to enjoy it in many other forms, including by Bram Stoker and Mary Shelley and all those who wrote like actual novels based on the letter form. And The Sorrows of Young Verta tell the story of a person who's it's through correspondence that's progressing over the years, to one person, to his friend, and he's telling him about his life. He traveled to a place. He's talking about the nature. He's talking about the encounters. He's kind of, you can see him walking around and seeing people going about their days and describing them in those letters, which is something that I was trying to do actually in lockdown when I first moved here, by writing mass emails to friends and still I jot down some notes about, impressions of ordinary things. And then you start seeing him, he falls in love, he falls out of love, he gets depressed, he starts struggling with very serious, complicated mental issues before those mental issues had a name at that time. And he did not have a name for them. Goethe didn't have a name for them. They're now described in many ways, like bipolar depression, for example, and all of that. And I think this was very important. And in retrospect, this has become very important to me because it is, it's similar to me. I'm someone who did not know any much about therapy. Syria also, and in some places, therapy is very much dismissed on the side. It's something that, quote unquote, is for crazy people or something. People would be even offended if you suggest that they do it. And I never went to that extreme, but it was completely outside of my life. And I would go through things not knowing what they were, but trying to express them sometimes when I'm talking to someone, writing to someone. And I would relate to Werther in that sense. And it's a truly wonderful, very short book that I recommend that people read. And for the last one, I thought I'd go with a new book. And whenever I read a new book, it's almost certainly not fiction, because I like old fiction. And it's a book that I read recently, like 2-3 months ago, and I'm still thinking about it. It's so fascinating. It's God and Anatomy by Francesca Stavrakopoulou. She's a professor of religion, history of religion, and in America, I think. And this book is amazing. I'm also fascinated by religion and the history of religion and mythology and all of that. And she manages to trace back, God, but mainly the one that's known to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So trace the history of Jehovah, but after removing all of the makeup and all of the additions that were made by philosophers and theologians and monks and experts and poets and emperors and over the centuries, and go back to trace ancient forms of worship, and even traces to when Jehovah used to be actually a member of a family of many gods, like Greek or Roman or Babylonian or Syrian mythologies. And he was part of the mythology himself. He had a wife, he had family, and she tells the story of Jehovah, the story of God that we think we know, through these forms of worship and through the body. So she takes a different approach to what some people do now, which is readapt God to kind of our modern standards. God maybe is genderless, God is, all of that. But what she says is, let's look at those books. She doesn't mention Quran very much, but the Old Testament and the New Testament. And let's look at him the way he wanted to be looked at. And this masculine kind of macho figure with, and she talks about his organs, his face, his genitals, his feet, to kind of course, she's not a believer, neither am I, and it kind of shows you. I've been reading books about religion for ages, but this one showed me things that are out there, but that are very hard to be seen, and I do recommend it to everyone who's interested.
Amazing. Well, Asser, thanks a lot for your time. This has been a fantastic chat, and I really enjoyed it.
I loved it too. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad to be on this podcast.